Skull: The Hollister Bloodline, a corrected script. There's a photograph that exists in the archives of a small Virginia county. It was never meant to be seen by the public. The girl in it is pale, her features are unnaturally similar to both her mother and her father in ways that defy coincidence. Her eyes are hollow, distant, like she's looking at something the rest of us can't see. Behind her, just barely visible in the frame, is a man. His face has been scratched out, not by time, but by someone's fingernail. The photo was taken in 1931 in a farmhouse that no longer exists, in a family that no one talks about anymore. This is the story of what happened there. This is the story of how a bloodline folded in on itself until there was nothing left but shadow. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Her name was Lillian Mae Hollister, though nobody called her that. They called her the Quiet One. She was born in 1914, the fourth child of Samuel and Ida Hollister, who themselves were first cousins. Their marriage was not unusual for the region. The Blue Ridge foothills were isolated, the roads were bad, and families married families they already knew. But Samuel and Ida's union was different. It was deliberate. It was planned. And it was only the beginning of something far darker. By the time Lillian was 7 years old, she had learned not to ask questions. She had learned that the man who visited her mother's bedroom at night was not always her father. She had learned that her older sister, Ruth, had disappeared one winter and returned 5 months later, thinner and silent. She had learned that some doors in the house stayed locked and that curiosity was a punishable thing. The family lived on 37 acres of rocky land surrounded by forest. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. No one came to visit, no one left. The Hollisters were not poor, but they lived like they were. They had money, an inheritance from Ida's father, a timber baron who had died under strange circumstances in 1908. But the money stayed in the bank, untouched, while the family ate canned beans and wore the same clothes year after year. It was as if they were punishing themselves, or hiding. In 1929, when Lillian was 15, her mother died. The official cause was listed as pneumonia. But the local doctor, a man named Dr. Harlan Webb, who kept meticulous notes that would later be sealed by court order, wrote something else in his private journal. He wrote, "The woman bore the signs of repeated trauma, internal, old and new. When I asked the husband, he told me to mind my business. When I asked the girl, she looked at me like I was already dead." Ida Hollister was buried on the property in a plot beside her father and her grandmother. No pastor came. No service was held. Samuel read from a Bible that had pages torn out, specific pages removed with such precision that you could barely tell they'd been there at all. Lillian stood beside her father and her 2 surviving siblings, watching the coffin lowered into the red clay. She did not cry. She had learned by then that crying brought attention, and attention brought consequence. After Ida's death, the house changed. Or maybe it just stopped pretending. Samuel began spending more time with Lillian. He would sit beside her at the dinner table, his hand resting on her knee beneath the wood. He would stand in the doorway of her bedroom at night, just watching, his breathing slow and deliberate. Her brother, Joseph, who was 19 and simple-minded, began sleeping in the barn. Her sister, Ruth, had already left, fled in the night with a traveling preacher, never to return. That left only Lillian and her father in the house alone together, locked in a routine that neither of them named. By the spring of 1930, Lillian had stopped going into town. She stopped attending the church socials, stopped walking to the general store for flour and salt. When neighbors asked about her, Samuel would smile, a thin, cold smile, and say she was helping with the house, that she was a good girl, that she was right where she belonged. No one pressed further. In those mountains, you didn't ask questions about what happened behind closed doors. In November of 1931, a midwife named Clara Pitts was summoned to the Hollister farm in the middle of the night. She arrived to find Lillian in labor, alone in an upstairs bedroom, her face turned toward the wall. Samuel stood in the hallway, arms crossed, silent. Clara had delivered over 200 babies in her 40 years of practice, but she would later say that this birth felt different. Wrong. The girl made no sound, not once. Even when the pain should have been unbearable, Lillian remained perfectly still, her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the room. The baby was a girl, small, pale, with a face that Clara recognized immediately, not because she had seen the child before, but because she had seen that exact face on both the mother and the father. The resemblance was not subtle. It was genetic, mathematical, unmistakable. Clara wrapped the infant in a blanket and handed her to Lillian, who held the child like it was made of glass or poison. Samuel appeared in the doorway. He looked at the baby for a long moment, then looked at Clara. "You were never here," he said. It was not a request. Clara left the house just before dawn. She told no one what she had seen, not her husband, not the county clerk, not even her pastor. But she wrote it down. In a diary that would be discovered decades later, buried in a trunk in her attic, she wrote, "That child was born of blood too close. I could see it in her bones. God forgive me. I should have taken her away, but I was afraid." The baby was named Charlotte. She was never registered with the county. No birth certificate was filed. No doctor examined her. For the first 2 years of her life, Charlotte existed only within the walls of that house, unseen by anyone outside the family. Lillian cared for her in silence, feeding her, changing her, rocking her to sleep in the same chair where her own mother had once rocked her. Samuel watched, always watching, waiting for something. By 1933, it became clear that Charlotte was not developing like other children. She did not speak. She did not walk. Her eyes followed movement, but there was no recognition in them, no spark of understanding or connection. Dr. Webb was finally called to the house, not by Samuel, but by a concerned postal worker, who had noticed that no one had been seen leaving the property in over a year. When Webb arrived, he found Lillian sitting on the porch, hollow-eyed and skeletal. Inside, he found Charlotte. The doctor's notes from that visit were clinical, detached, but beneath the medical terminology, you could sense his horror. He documented severe developmental delays, physical deformities consistent with genetic disorders, and signs of what he called hereditary degeneration. He noted that the child's facial structure bore disturbing similarity to multiple family members across generations and that her condition suggested a bloodline compromised by repeated consanguineous unions. In plain language, Charlotte was the product of generations of inbreeding, and her body was paying the price. But Webb noted something else, something he could barely bring himself to write. When he examined Lillian, he found evidence that she was pregnant again, 4 months along. When he asked who the father was, she turned her face away and said nothing. Samuel, standing in the corner of the room, smiled. That same thin, cold smile. Webb left the house that day and went directly to the county sheriff, a man named Coleman Burke. He told Burke everything, the condition of the child, the state of the girl, the suffocating wrongness of that house. Burke listened. He nodded. He said he would look into it. He never did. Years later, in a deathbed confession to his son, Burke admitted why. Samuel Hollister had money, he said, and money in those days bought silence. But it was more than that. That family, he confessed, there was something wrong with them, something old, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I was afraid of what I'd find if I went digging. So, no one dug. No one intervened. And Lillian gave birth again in secret. In the spring of 1934, another girl, this one lived only 3 days. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. The child was buried on the property in an unmarked grave beside Ida. No record exists of her name, if she was even given one. Lillian never spoke of her. Charlotte, now 3 years old, remained trapped in the body and mind of an infant, unable to feed herself, unable to recognize her own mother. The house had become a tomb for the living, and Samuel had become something else entirely, not quite human anymore, but a kind of walking monument to a family's slow collapse into itself. In the summer of 1935, a traveling census worker named Margaret Finch arrived at the Hollister farm. She was young, idealistic, determined to document every household in the county, no matter how remote. She knocked on the door of the farmhouse and waited. Lillian answered. Margaret would later describe the girl as looking ancient, though she couldn't have been more than 21. Her hair was gray in places. Her hands shook. When Margaret asked to come inside to record the household information, Lillian whispered 2 words, "Please go." But Margaret was persistent. She stepped past Lillian into the front room and immediately understood the warning. The smell hit her first, rot and sickness and something else, something she couldn't name. Then she saw Charlotte lying on a blanket in the corner, her body twisted, her breathing shallow. Then she saw Samuel emerging from the shadows like he'd been waiting there all along. He did not speak. He simply stared at Margaret until she backed toward the door, apologizing, her census book forgotten on the floor. She reported what she saw to the county health office. An investigation was opened. 2 officials were dispatched to the farm in August. They found the house abandoned. The front door was open. Inside, furniture remained, clothes hung in closets, food sat rotting on the table, but the Hollisters were gone. All of them, Samuel, Lillian, Charlotte, vanished. A search was conducted. Dogs were brought in. The surrounding woods were combed for days. Nothing. No bodies, no trail, no sign of where they had gone or how they had left. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole. For decades, the Hollister farm sat empty. The house decayed slowly, reclaimed by vines, weather, and time. Local children told stories about it, that you could hear a baby crying from the upstairs window, that shadows moved behind the glass even though no one was inside, that anyone who entered the house felt suddenly, violently ill. These were just stories, but stories exist for a reason. They're how we make sense of things we're not supposed to understand. In 1967, a developer purchased the land with plans to subdivide it into residential lots. During excavation, workers unearthed something that brought the entire project to a halt. Buried beneath the barn in a shallow grave covered with lime were 3 skeletons, 2 adults, 1 child. The remains were sent to the state medical examiner who determined they had been in the ground for approximately 30 years. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull. All 3, execution style. The bones were tested. DNA analysis was still primitive in 1967, but forensic anthropologists could make certain determinations based on skeletal structure and morphology. What they found disturbed them so deeply that the full report was never made public. The 2 adult skeletons, male and female, showed bone abnormalities consistent with inherited genetic disorders. But it was the child's remains that were most troubling. Her skull showed signs of severe malformation. Her teeth had grown in patterns that suggested extreme inbreeding, and her bones. The examiner wrote in his notes, "I have never seen a human skeleton with this degree of hereditary degradation. If I didn't know better, I would say this child's parents shared more than half their DNA." The skeletons were Samuel, Lillian, and Charlotte. The evidence suggested they had been killed sometime in late 1935, shortly after the census workers' visit. But here's what doesn't make sense. If all 3 were dead, who buried them? Who filled in the grave, scattered lime to accelerate decomposition, covered the site with barn floor planking? Who locked the house from the inside and left the table set as if the family had simply stepped away? The case was never solved. The investigation went cold within months, filed away in a basement archive where it gathered dust for 50 years. But the story didn't end, because in 1989, a woman named Eleanina Marsh walked into a genealogy library in Richmond, Virginia, carrying a shoebox full of letters and photographs. She was 73 years old, dying of cancer, and she said she had a confession to make. Elianina was Ruth Hollister's daughter. Ruth, Lillian's older sister, was the one who had fled with the traveling preacher in 1929. Elianina explained that her mother had lived the rest of her life in silence, refusing to speak about the family she'd escaped, refusing even to acknowledge their existence. But on her deathbed in 1986, Ruth had finally broken. She told Elianina everything, about the uncles who were also cousins, about the grandfather who was also a great-uncle, about the marriages that weren't really marriages but arrangements designed to keep the bloodline pure, keep the money in the family, keep the secrets buried. Ruth told her daughter that the Hollister family had been practicing deliberate inbreeding for 4 generations. It started with Lillian's great-grandfather, a man named Silas Hollister, who believed that bloodline purity was a form of spiritual protection. He married his niece, their children married each other, and the pattern continued, spiraling inward, generation after generation, until the genetics became a noose. Ruth had escaped, but Lillian never could. Lillian was the chosen one, the keeper of the line, the vessel. And when Charlotte was born, proof of the bloodline's corruption, a walking monument to their sin, Samuel made a decision. He couldn't let the world see what they had created. He couldn't let anyone know how far they had fallen. So one night in the summer of 1935, he gathered his daughter and his granddaughter in the barn and he ended it. Then, according to Ruth, he walked into the woods with a rifle and ended himself. His body was never found. Some believe he's still out there, buried somewhere in those mountains, unmarked and unremembered. Elianina donated everything to the archive: letters written in cipher, photographs with faces scratched out, a family Bible with a genealogy chart that looped back on itself like a snake eating its tail. Researchers spent years trying to untangle the Hollister bloodline, and what they found was mathematically horrifying. By the time Lillian gave birth to Charlotte, the child's parents shared approximately 62% of their DNA. For context, full siblings share 50%. Charlotte wasn't just inbred. She was the genetic equivalent of a photocopy, degraded beyond repair. The farmhouse was demolished in 1991. The land was never developed. Today, it sits empty, marked only by a historical survey tag that reads, Site of former homestead c. 1880 to 1935. No structures remain. If you visit, you'll find nothing but trees and silence. But if you dig, and some have, you'll find fragments, rusted nails, shards of glass, pieces of bone that the excavation missed. There's no moral to this story. No lesson except this: some families collapse under the weight of their own secrets. Some bloodlines were never meant to continue. And some stories, no matter how deeply you bury them, will eventually claw their way back to the surface. Lillian Mae Hollister gave birth in secret, but we know the father now. We've always known. We just didn't want to look. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you the way it unsettled me, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think happened in those final days. Tell us if you believe the woods still hold Samuel's body. And if you want more stories like this, stories the history books won't tell you, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more families like the Hollisters, more secrets buried in America's soil, and we're going to find every single one.